We've all seen examples of someone showing up to an event with a big donation check to a charity, and it's all big and public. Or maybe you've seen someone go to a community service event and there's a camera crew in tow just to know that they can get footage of how great they are to show off later. And these types of things, they're bittersweet because on the one hand, they're doing something good for charity, they're doing something good for the community, but there's still this yuck factor when people do this kind of thing for attention or to show off. And Jesus has a plan for charity so that people can still be the light without the yuck factor of someone trying to do it for attention or clout. In Matthew chapter 6, here's what he says in his Sermon on the Mount. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. If you're reading through the Sermon on the Mount, this seems like a totally different segment if you just pick it up right at the beginning of Matthew chapter 6. But just so you know, these chapter divisions were not what the original authors intended to do. These were one solid work. So when Matthew's writing the gospel according to Matthew, he's not saying, all right, that ends chapter 5, let's start chapter 6. Actually, chapters weren't put into the Bible until the 13th or the 14th century. And then they added verse numbers in the 15th and 16th centuries. Different translations, different groups of people were trying to do this type of work to make it easier to find a certain location in the Bible. But in doing so, it inserts these divisions, which makes you think, okay, chapter 5 was one thing and chapter 6 is another thing. But this is all part of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. It's a direct flow out of the end of Matthew chapter 5. In Matthew 5, Jesus is trying to illustrate this point that it's not just about following the rules and making sure that you don't sin by crossing boundaries, but it's about an internal condition of the heart where the kingdom takes place so that the sin isn't even possible anymore because your heart has been renovated. And so in Matthew chapter 6, there is a turn. There's a transition for sure, because he's not quoting Old Testament laws, but what he is doing is he's continuing that same thing. In the previous chapter, he was saying, you've heard it said, don't do these external sins, but I tell you, renovate the internal condition. In chapter 6, he says, when you practice righteousness, we get this in the summary statement in the first verse of chapter 6. Be careful when you practice your righteousness. It shouldn't just be an external thing. There should be an internal condition. And Jesus' way of encoding this in the text is talking about your Father who sees what is done in secret, the things that are internal versus the things that are external for everyone to see. See, going beyond the righteousness of the Pharisees isn't just about sin. It's also in charity and in prayer and in fasting, these things that we're going to unpack in the next few videos. And his way of summarizing these points is, if you do things in public, you receive one reward, but if you do things in private, you receive a different reward from your Father in heaven. Now, he talks about the hypocrites, and hypocrite is an interesting term because I think a lot of times we automatically ascribe it to religious scenarios or people who say one thing but then do another. Hypocrite is actually an acting term, and he says, don't be like the actors, like the fakers, the hypocrites, who do acts of generosity so they can be seen by other people and be acclaimed and rewarded for their generosity in public. He calls these people hypocrites because they are doing something externally that doesn't match internally. Just like an actor, they put on a role, they put on a face to be a certain type of person for the film or the TV show that they're in or the play that they're in, but then inside, who they actually are does not match that external appearance. And so the hypocrites that Jesus is talking about here, they're these people who they put on this act of being generous, but really what they're trying to do is get attention for these acts of generosity. And if they're doing this thing to be seen by people, Jesus drops this line. Well, they've received their reward in full. What is their reward? Well, if they're doing a thing for attention, Jesus says, well, they get their reward in full because if they get attention, well, that's what they get. That's all they're going to get, though. See, when you do acts of charity, there's actually something deeper and more satisfying and more fulfilling that if you're just doing it for attention, well, you're not going to get those other rewards. What you're going to get is the thing that you tried to get, which was attention, likes, accolade, clout. If you're doing good stuff for those things, well, that's all you're going to get. Jesus' alternative to this, though, is that instead of doing things in public to get attention, what you should do is you should do things in secret. Now, in Matthew chapter 5, in that previous series, if you haven't seen those videos, probably should check out that playlist after finishing up this video. But you'll know that Jesus isn't about just making up a bunch of new rules. It's not like when he says, "You've heard it said, but I say." It's not like there were some old rules and now there's these new rules that you also have to do as well. He's not just turning up or dialing up the difficulty in the law. What he's doing is he's transforming the law to show God's original intent, which has to do with a renovation of the heart, which is not just a new law. So when Jesus says, do your deeds in secret, he's not making a new rule. So if you're like, oh no, I gave publicly and I put my name on my check, it wasn't anonymous. Jesus isn't saying you're sinning if you don't give anonymously. What he's doing is he's trying to show something about your heart. And here's the clue that we get from him. He says, when you give, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Now that's a weird statement to be like, okay, how are my hands not going to know what the other thing is doing? They're all connected to my brain. They're all obviously going to know what the other things are doing. I think it's best to illustrate this with something that I picked up in college. I was in the male chorale in my time at Azusa Pacific University in undergrad, and there were some other actual music majors. I was just there. I don't know why I was taking this class, but there were other music majors, and some of them, we obviously had some practice at doing things like conducting. And one of the things that you have to do in playing certain instruments, like the drums, or in conducting, is you need to be able to do separate things with your hands, keeping time differently and showing different movements with each hand. So one of the drills that they would do is they would do this sort of thing where with your left hand, they would be 2 beats, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And then with your right hand, they would do 3 beats, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And they would then practice those things together, which I remember when I saw these guys doing this thing the first time, I was blown away that they were able to split their mind and do 2 separate motions, counting to 2 and counting to 3. But you'll notice that I'm doing this while talking now. It's because if you practice this thing long enough, it becomes an automatic behavior. I remember the first time I was like, okay, maybe I can, okay, if I just focus, oh my gosh, I got it, I did it, guys. Like the first time you do something that's difficult, you're like, wow, I need to let everyone know what an amazing thing. But after you get used to doing a thing, it becomes an automatic behavior that you don't have to think about anymore. And this is what Jesus is saying with don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. He's saying the thing that you're doing should be so automatic that it's just a background running behavior. You don't even notice that you're being generous because it's the type of person that you are. Okay, so maybe this is like a little obscure, but another example would be if you know how to ride a bike, probably when you were a kid and the first time you learned how to ride a bike, when you first went down the street, you probably were thrilled and you're like, everybody look at me, I'm riding a bike, woo, I'm a bike rider now. That was me when I was under the age of 10. I can't remember exactly when I rode a bike first, but I'm over 40 now. And if I'm riding around my neighborhood on my bike, passing every neighbor being like, hey, everyone, look at me. Hey, bike rider here. I am riding a bike. Everyone, look at me. I'm riding. Like, that's silly. I don't need to get attention for riding a bike because once you ride a bike long enough, it's just an automatic behavior that you do. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Means that you've programmed generosity so deeply into your soul that that's just the type of person that you are. And when you become this type of person who gives in secret, where your left hand doesn't know what your right hand is doing, your Father sees that and will reward you. Now, this is where the language gets a little tricky because you're like, okay, wait, I'm not supposed to be selfish and greedy, but then I'm going to be not selfish and greedy and going to be generous so that I can get other rewards. Well, this is why we have to take this in the context of the entire Sermon on the Mount, that Jesus is talking about, you know, who has the good life? The people who exist in the kingdom of God, who are under the range of God's effective will, where God's reign has sovereignty and power in their life. And if you are a generous person, your Father sees that and will reward you in the type of credit that goes in the kingdom of God. It's not jewels and gold and a 401k in the afterlife. That's not the type of thing that it is, but it's an actual transformed existence that lets you know that you are living the good life. Now, there's a lot of confusion about what the good life is, which is why he starts his sermon with this declaration of blessing to the most unlucky people in the world, because the good life is when you actually have God in your life and you live according to the way that God desired for all of us to live. When you live generously, It seems counterintuitive because you're like, wait, I'm giving away stuff, I'm giving away my money. But if you know anyone who is a generous person, what you'll know is they have access to joy and satisfaction and contentment that stingy, greedy people do not have. So your Father sees what is done in secret, and he rewards you in kingdom currency. So if we are going to be Jesus's kingdom people that he's talking about in this kingdom manifesto, the Sermon on the Mount, then we are going to be the type of people who live generously with everybody around us. We give generously to the poor, we give generously to our friends and our enemies, as we learned in Matthew chapter 5, because if you are a generous person, if you have the kingdom life inside of you, then this type of living is really the good life, and it can actually change the world. So go be generous people. Practice building the automatic skill of generosity and change this world that way.